Upon reaching the hunting grounds, Alan peered into the valley. Then a deep and heavy sigh escaped his mouth. As Alan stood there, he began to reflect on everything that had happened. His mood soured greatly the more he reflected. Suddenly, a noise of flapping wings brought Alan out of his thoughtful trance. From the sky to the valley below, a single red pterosaur landed on a nearby tree. They had perched themselves marvelously atop the tree with swift balance and adroit precision. The whole performance was captivating. The red pterosaur appeared to be a growing adolescent, probably not much younger than Alan. Based on their physical attributes, Alan could determine that the pterosaur was feminine overall. Typically, pterosaurs with larger head crests were males. This pterosaur had a crest that was somewhat smaller, with an equally proportionate body size to match. The pterosaur sat upon the tree for a few moments, looking around, their head movements swift and agile, as if they were scanning the local environment around them. Alan transfixed himself to monitor the pterosaur. There is something to hunt, he thought to himself sarcastically, with a face that looked unenthusiastic. Pterosaurs were a viable target to hunt. However, that only happened if the hunt is successful. Based on prior experiences, Alan already knows that hunting a pterosaur is a waste of time, especially since this particular pterosaur is perched perfectly in a tree that is very far off the ground. Any attempt to catch the pterosaur would end in failure, as the pterosaur can easily escape at any given moment. The longer Alan gazed at the creature, his thoughts muddled with longing. He thought that the pterosaur was rather lucky, being able to fly anywhere and escape into the vast sky. Shifting their posture, the pterosaur began to peck the branches of the tree. The incessant pecking continued until something fell on the ground below. A shallow chirp escaped the mouth of the pterosaur, as if frustrated. Once again, the pterosaur pecked the tree until another object fell to the ground. The pterosaur let out another annoyed chirp. Alan simply observed this cycle of the pterosaur pecking the tree over and over. Eventually, Alan noticed a pattern. The pterosaur was fixated on obtaining these strange objects on the tree itself, not the ones that fell on the ground. Could these objects be a type of food for the pterosaur? Alan had an idea and decided to walk calmly under the tree where the pterosaur resided. At this point, alarming the pterosaur was of no concern. If Alan genuinely attempted to hunt the pterosaur, the result would end in failure anyway. Anticipating success was simply foolhardy. Instead, the curiosity of these strange objects intrigued him more than alerting the pterosaur. The pterosaur was completely engrossed by their ritualistic feeding to notice Alan's approach. Upon arriving underneath the tree, Alan evaluated the strange objects littered across the ground. The objects were round, rather large, and appeared to be dark brown. Alan decided to pick one up with his hands to investigate. With one round object in his hands, Alan tried sniffing. There was nothing special about what he was holding. In fact, the object smelled like any other earthly odor. A pungent, grassy stink. Eventually, his presence beneath the tree was noticed by the pterosaur, who then looked down from above and chirped. Alan detached himself from his investigation and looked up at the pterosaur in confusion. "What is this thing?" Alan asked, blatantly ignoring the weird circumstance that he was talking to a pterosaur. The pterosaur just chirped and screeched at his face. However, her verbal cries were not directed at Alan, but the object he was holding. Her gaze was fixated on the object in Alan's hand. "You want this?" Alan asked again, first looking down at his hands, then back towards the pterosaur. A simple chirp replied to Alan's question, with no movement from the pterosaur. Alan decided to concede to her unwavered patience by holding the strange object up above his head. With swift movement, she pecked the object with brutal force until a cracking sound was heard. Alan winced at each strike the pterosaur was making on the object. The succession of strikes was loosening the grip that Alan had on the object. However, he held on, tightening his hand harder until the pounding stopped. Then, the pterosaur chirped and resumed their steely stare at Alan. Alan was completely puzzled. What happened? Still holding the object up without moving, Alan just stood there. The pterosaur screeched in his face once more. For some reason, Alan was beginning to understand the pterosaur and lowered the object down. Alan re-examined the object once again in his hands and found a crack where the pterosaur pecked. Alan then decided to sniff the newfound crack. A sweet and pungent scent entered his nostrils. At this point, Alan was completely dumbfounded. This object had no scent before, but now has a peculiar and sensitive smell. The pterosaur did something to make this object smell differently. How? Upon thinking about what happened carefully, Alan recalled the pecking that the pterosaur did to cause the object's newfound change. The pterosaur screeched once again at Alan. Alan looked up instantly at the pterosaur. Her head jerked towards the object, and another screech followed thereafter. The animated communication was now stumping Alan on what to do next. "What do I do now?" Alan asked. A simple and curt chirp was the response of the pterosaur, followed by her continued steely stare. After a few moments of being perplexed, Alan carefully looked at the object once more. He assumed that the object is now ready to be eaten. Without thinking much further, he decided to bite the whole object. The sweet nectar from within the object poured into Alan's mouth. The taste was delectable, however, at the same time, strange. But the experience was cut short due to a rising unsavory taste. Alan coughed as the shell from the object was unsatisfying and awful tasting. He began to spit out the contents of the shell in rapid succession to eliminate the foul aftertaste. The pterosaur, pleased with Alan's action of eating, chirped a few times happily from their position and resumed her feeding cycle. Alan was still trying to recover from his experience. The liquid from within the object was somewhat tasty, but everything else was terrible. After his coughing fit was over, Alan realized something as he looked up at the pterosaur. This was fun. Alan started laughing. This type of experience was far from what he was anticipating this day to turn out. As Alan began to settle his laughter, he noticed how relaxed he felt. This distraction was a gift from the pterosaur. The events from the morning were put aside briefly. However, all good things must come to an end. "Well, I have to get going. Thanks for spending time with me," Alan said to the pterosaur. The pterosaur did not seem fazed by Alan's goodbye, and continued eating those strange objects in the tree. With a swift turn, Alan jogged towards the hunting grounds. The pterosaur noticed Alan's departure and chirped. After a few moments of watching Alan, the pterosaur returned to flying in the sky, only this time the pterosaur followed in Alan's direction.